So in this video, we're going to be talking about cellular respiration. Cellular respiration is basically the process where living cells break down glucose that can either come from photosynthesis or absorbing from other types of organisms, and we use these glucose molecules that release energy, and this energy comes in the form of ATP. Energy allows us to do lots of things such as breathing, walking, all of those. So first, let's look at this equation over here. We take the glucose from the definition, and from there we produce carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. So this ATP is nothing but energy. Water and carbon dioxide are basically a waste products. So we should have glucose and oxygen coming in, while carbon dioxide, water, and ATP coming out at the end. Now, if we were to look at this more closely, we can see this is almost a mere identical representation of the photosynthesis equation. The only real thing is that these are the products and the reactants are switched. See, for the products, the plant takes in carbon dioxide, water, and in this case, instead of chemical energy, it takes in sunlight, and it releases glucose and oxygen. This shows how these two are basically very similar to the photosynthesis process. This shows that plants are able to produce photosynthesis and cellular respiration at the same time. So what happens is the glucose enters into this large cell. So since there are 6 carbon molecules inside glucose, we enter into the first stage called glycolysis. These are where the cell enzymes split the glucose into 2 pyruvate molecules, 2 ATP and 2 NADH. Here we already have the ATP being formed. However, what is pyruvate and what is NADH? Well, let's first talk about pyruvate. So pyruvate is a metabolic molecule, while NADH is a coenzyme. This coenzyme allows us to be able to carry high energy electrons. So the 2 NADH would be able to carry electrons. Next, we move into this transition phase. This is before we enter into the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. The pyruvate, as we saw before, oxidates with the oxygen that's also coming into the cell, and through that, it creates another coenzyme called acetyl-CoA. This acetyl-CoA is then later used in the Krebs cycle. So what happens is the 2 acetyl-CoA plus this oxaloacetic acid are combined, and with the enzymes create citric acid. Hence the reason it's called the citric acid cycle. Now, this transition phase also creates 2 NADH, again a coenzyme to carry electrons, which will later be used, and 2 carbon dioxide. Now we're going to be moving into the Krebs cycle, or the citric acid cycle. So we already talked about what happens to the acetyl-CoA as it turns into citric acid, but now what happens is here, we take this oxaloacetic acid, and it turns into 6 carbon dioxides, 2 ATP, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH. Now, what is FADH? It's pretty much similar to NADH. It's also another coenzyme that's used to carry high energy electrons. Now, all of this is still inside the intermitochondrial membrane, since this is all happening inside the mitochondria, which is the powerhouse of the cell, and that's how the energy comes to the cell. It's because in the mitochondria, the energy is being broken down from the glucose, and that's the reason why the mitochondria is considered the powerhouse. In the mitochondrial matrix, while all of this is happening, now we have 6 NADH, 2 FADH, 2 ATP, and 6 carbon dioxide. So if we look closer over here, we have to consider this NADH and FADH now. Because what happens is, since they've been holding these high energy electrons, what happens is they enter into these electron carriers. This is between the mitochondrial matrix and the intermembrane space. Now we're left with 6 carbon dioxide molecules, 2 ATP, 6 NADH, and 2 FADH. So what happens is, these molecules over here travel through the mitochondrial matrix and enter into this zone over here, where we have basically the border between the mitochondrial matrix and the intermembrane space. Between this border are these electron carriers. If we zoom in, we can see a better look over here. Now, these electron carriers, since the NADH and FADH were carrying high energy electrons this entire time, what's happening is that it will release these electrons into the electron carriers. And since they're high energy, they will release protons in return. Now these protons come together to create a proton gradient. And what happens is this proton gradient then enters into another part called the ATP synthase. So in the ATP synthase, these are also high energy protons. This proton gradient generates enough energy so that it's able to create ATP. But how does this exactly work? Well, if we were to look inside, there's something in the ATP synthase and it's called ADP. ADP is basically similar to ATP except it's lacking a phosphorus atom because it's a phosphorus element. Because it's lacking a phosphorus element, what happens is that the energy from the proton gradient needs to push that phosphorus element to be able to join with the ADP, hence later creating ATP. Now that it's created ATP, let's calculate how much ATP happens through this entire process. So we get 2 ATP over here in glycolysis. Then after that, we get around 2 ATP over here in the Krebs cycle. And then lastly, if we look at this, one FADH creates 2 ATP, while one NADH creates 3 ATP because the NADH has a more high energy electrons than the FADH. Because the FADH was released later, it didn't get that much high energy electrons. So one NADH creates 3 ATP, and since in the end we have around 10 NADH, that creates 30, and since at the end we have 2 FADH from the Krebs cycle, that creates 4 ATP. So 30 plus 4 plus 2 plus 2 creates 38 ATP in total. Here is the entire part over here. The total ATP is found in this formula right here. Now there isn't an exact number. This is mainly estimate. However, this is a pretty reasonable number. This is all about the cellular respiration. The cellular respiration allows living organisms to be able to release energy from the glucose molecules they either obtain from photosynthesis or obtain from other organisms. Also, just before I end the video, there were other parts in this equation over here. We saw how the glucose comes over here in the cell and the oxygen comes over here with the 2-pyruvate in the transition phase. And we also saw how the energy is created over here, but we didn't talk about the water or CO2. Over here, we had 6 CO2 molecules. They also eventually get released out through exhaling, and the water also gets released. Where? And the water also gets released here. But where does the water come from? Well, we have these extra electrons over here, and oxygen acts as the final acceptor for these electrons. So we take 1/2 of a oxygen molecule plus 2 regular of these electron molecules, and then we create H2O. This is all about the cellular respiration.